Well, hello there. Pastor Tim here, coming at you with another episode of Bible Biker Riding with the Word. And we got a little snow here, so enjoy the pretty background as we try to keep this bike upright today. In this episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to address some comments and questions that were left in my comments of my last Bible Biker video, episode 19. And these questions were critical of certain passages in the Bible pertaining to slavery and God's alleged condoning of the act of slavery. So let's look at these verses that are in question.
Exodus 21, verses 20 and 21. And if a man smite his servant or maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is mighty. Moreover, of the children of strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families, and are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession. And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule one over another. Ephesians 6:5. Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, and sinlessness of your heart, as unto Christ.
So as we can see here, these verses in question are certainly disturbing when you read them on their own. And I assure you, once you put them in context, they make a lot more sense. And I somewhat addressed these passages, not directly, but in a previous video on the book of Philemon, which we'll talk about here in a bit. But I want to look at some other passages, some other verses contained in these same books of Exodus and Leviticus that shed some light on this discussion and may help us understand these passages a little bit better. So let's look at these few verses here.
Leviticus chapter 25, starting at verse 39 to verse 41. And if thy brother that dwelleth with thee be waxen poor, and be sold unto thee, thou shalt not compel him to serve as a bondservant, as a hired servant, and as a sojourner. He shall be with thee, and shall serve thee unto the year of Jubilee. And then shall he depart from thee, both he and his children. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 18. But thou shalt remember that thou was a bondsman in Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee hence. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. Leviticus 25, 27 and 28. Then let him count the years of the sale thereof, and restore the overplus unto the man to whom he sold it. Then he may return unto his possessions. But if he be not able to restore it to him, then that which is sold shall remain in the hand of him that bought it until the year of Jubilee. And in the Jubilee it shall go out, and he shall return unto his possessions. Exodus 21, verse 5. And if a servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, and I will not go out free.
So as we see in these verses that pertain about slavery as well, it sheds a little light that perhaps the slavery we're reading about in the Bible is not the kind of slavery we're used to. Many folks in the West, particularly in America, when they think of slavery, they think of slavery in America's history, which was absolutely atrocious. Slavery was based on the idea that certain races of people, particularly Africans, were less than other races, particularly whites. And these folks were forced into slavery, free work, free labor with no pay, and often mistreated and just such an awful thing. And nowhere in the Bible is such a thing condoned. In fact, racism itself is outright condoned in the Bible. But when we read about slavery in the Old Testament, it's a lot different than what we think about in the modern era. You know, today we have social safety nets. You know, if you're downtrodden in society, we have welfare, housing, HUD programs, food stamps, other things to help sustain folks. Thousands of years ago, they didn't have such luxuries. And many of the laws that you read about in the Old Testament are particularly for the nation of Israel at that time. at a time where there was not social safety nets. And many people that couldn't make it on their own would often incur great debt or choose to become a slave to sustain themselves and their family. And it was more of an indentured servitude type of relationship where they were getting paid, they were provided a living, they were provided housing, they were provided food, because otherwise they could not take care of themselves. And as we see the Bible, as you read through the Bible, as we go through the history of humanity and God's relationship with man, you can see God working away from the relationship of master and slave, saying we're all equal in the eyes of the Lord. And it talks all about forgiving debt that's incurred. And it talks about releasing your slaves of the debt they owe. And as we've seen in those passages I read, you were supposed to release your slave after such a long period, whether it be the 7-year release of debts for Hebrew slaves, or even the 50-year Jubilee where all debts were forgiven, including that of a slave who was indebted to his master. We also see, as we continue, there are provisions for if your slave has paid off their debt and you release them and they don't want to leave, how to handle that. Now, the idea that a slave wouldn't want to leave sheds some light that the type of slavery they're talking about in the Old Testament, again, is not akin to the kind of slavery we think about in the modern context of American history and more modern history with slavery. But again, the Bible is working to move away from this type of relationship altogether. As I said, I covered the book of Philemon before, and in that book we see a slave escapes the title of the letter, which Paul wrote to Philemon, escapes Philemon, who rightfully is owed a debt by his slave, and his slave is working that debt off. But this slave escapes and runs into Paul. I believe his name is Omniscium. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. But as Omniscium is learning from Paul, he learns about the gospel and he becomes a Christian. And Paul sends it back saying, listen, you owe Philemon this debt. You need to go back to him and pay this debt off, work this debt off. You are rightfully his slave, and you need to pay your debt. But he sends him back with this letter telling Philemon, hey, he's rightfully your servant. He owes you this debt, and he needs to work it off. But I would encourage you, instead of receiving him back as a slave, instead receive him back as a brother in Christ, freeing him of his debt, and you gain a brother in Christ, which is greater than a slave. So again, the book and the illustration of this interaction between Paul and Philemon is illustrative of God's work throughout all human history to get us away from these types of relationships of master and slave, realizing we've all been forgiven our great debt of sin, and illustrating that through the relationship of slaves owing a debt to their masters. And it's just beautiful how the Bible illustrates that God has forgiven us of the great debt of sin we owe, and as a result, anybody that owes us a debt, we should also forgive them of their sins. So yes, if we look in the Old Testament, there are some troubling passages about slavery, and it should make you feel bad to know that there were times when people were slaves and people were mistreated. But we can see through the Bible and through the action of God that we moved away from those things. And if it wasn't for Christianity, those followers of Christ and his teachings, I don't believe slavery would have ever been abolished in the modern Western world. So we can thank God first and foremost, but also his servants in Christ, the Christian church, for working so hard, even at their own risk of their own livelihoods and even life sometimes, to abolish slavery. So I hope this has shed some light on these difficult passages we read about on slavery in the Old Testament. And I hope it also encourages you, if somebody owes you a debt, of you being willing to forgive them of their debt and loving them as a brother or sister in Christ. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Bible Biker, and hope to see you in the next episode. And as always, I'm going to leave you with some pretty clips of the beautiful scenery here today. Thank you all so much for watching, and God bless. Man, I can't see a thing. Oh, boy.